Wow, last night I was wandering around the house, couldn't sleep, just meandering around, cats following me wherever I went because they follow me wherever I go. That's my Tonkinese. They're like puppy dogs. Anyway, I started thinking about, oh my goodness, how many years ago I started with cats. And I remembered being just a toddler, excuse me, and Peggy Dugan was my nanny. She came from East Mauritius, I think, and that wasn't her maiden name. That was her married name. She was married to Buddy Dugan. But Peggy was only around 16 when she was my nanny. She was more than a nanny to me. She was my friend, and she loved cats as much as I did. So whenever I played in the yard, there was always a cat around. I don't know where those cats came from, whether they lived in the neighborhood or whether they were actually my family's cats or whatever. But there was always a cat nearby, and Peggy and I played with the cats. Peggy would be the equivalent of an au pair today, uh, if there was any such thing back in the very early 40s. Um, we're talking about maybe 1941, 1942, and we lived on Ocean Avenue in San Mauritius in a house that someone else had started, but um, couldn't finish, so my dad bought the house from him, and he finished the house. I remember my bedroom because there were three pictures on the wall. One great big picture of uh, a, a bear with two cubs, and two little pictures of the cubs. I've always loved animals. I grew up on a duck farm. When I say I grew up on a duck farm, I didn't actually live on the farm. We lived elsewhere, first on North Ocean Avenue and then later on Union Avenue. But I used to go to the farm with Dad all the time because I loved seeing the ducks and I loved playing on the farm, and sometimes I'd bring some friends with me and we'd play in the feed house or one of the barns or whatever, and there were always animals around, especially dogs. We always had terriers because they would chase the rats and kill them. Um, there were always cats. I remember my dad putting out big flat plates of food for the cats. He would stop at the Ralston Purina store in San Mauritius and buy the cat food and the dog food and bring it up to the farm, and he'd dump it into these big plates. Sometimes there was milk for the cats, but not always. They mostly ate dry food. And the cats, of course, lived in the barn where they'd get rid of all the mice. And when you have poultry, you have pellets, which is naturally going to bring vermin. And so the cats and the dogs were absolutely essential to life on the farm. My life with cats seems to have begun when I was just about maybe 2 years old. Um, was during the war years when I can remember my I can remember being in the bedroom with my mom with the black shades all pulled down so that the room was completely dark except for a little red light in the corner. And my dad would be out on the beaches patrolling because that was his job during the war years. He wasn't allowed to join one of the forces because he was a duck grower. So being involved with food meant that he couldn't be in the Army or the Navy or any of the other forces. but he patrolled the shores. Um, I don't remember having a cat in the house at that time, which makes sense because my mother really didn't like animals. My dad was the animal person. And we always had animals on the farm, as I said, dogs and cats, and of course the ducks. I think there were some chickens too occasionally, um, but mostly the dogs and the cats. And they weren't pets. They were there for a purpose. They were there to get rid of the vermin, which would have eaten the pellets, which Dad fed the ducks, and of course that would have cut into the profits. Um, so anyway, I my memories of the farm are very sharp. I can remember going into the brooder houses or the baby duck houses, uh, which were these long um, wooden houses with a plank boardwalk down the middle. And we would walk down the middle of the boardwalk, and the dogs would run alongside the boardwalk and tilt these huge pellet bins over on their sides, or sometimes the men would tilt them, and then the dogs would go after the rats and kill them. My dad and his employees also carried shotguns, um, and that was for their own safety. But once I remember Joe Huntz, who was a Russian or Polish guy, spoke very little English, was doing the rat patrol with us in the brooder house, and Dad had said, "Don't forget to tie the bottom of your pants closed because you really don't want a rat to run up your pants." Well, Joe Huntz didn't tie his pants closed, and a rat did run up his leg. And oh my goodness, you should have seen Joe Hunt bumping around and yelling and trying to get the rat out from under his pants. And it was really funny, especially to a kid who didn't realize that poor Joe could have been bitten or really hurt. But fortunately, he didn't get bitten or hurt. And he learned his lesson because after that, he tied his pants closed. We also had wild dogs, packs of them that would attack the ducks. And that was another reason that Dad and the other men carried shotguns, because unfortunately, these were really wild dogs. They had no homes, they weren't fed, and I guess the ducks and whatever other wildlife were around were their only source of food and water on the farm. So, unfortunately, uh, they had to be shot, which was pretty sad. Even back in those days, people didn't always look after their animals and keep them at home. And of course, there were no leash laws back then. People just let their animals roam. That's the way life was back in the 40s.